It's occurred to me only just now that my mug purple and my shirt purple are very clashing. I really did not coordinate this very well, so I'm just gonna try to keep this out of the frame as much as possible. Several weeks ago now in a Q&A, one of you asked a really great question, and I kind of teased that I might do an entire video about this, but afterward I went ahead and asked my Patreons if it was actually something that you were interested in, and a lot of my patrons said absolutely. So I'm gonna do this video today about language barriers. Just in case you're new to my channel, my name is Andrea. I'm an expat living in France, so French is basically where I experienced the majority of language barriers, but I learned Spanish at university before I ever learned French, so I have experienced it with that. I have traveled to countries where I don't speak the language at all, so I have dealt with language barriers quite a bit, especially in the past 5 years or so, where I've traveled a lot more and where I've mostly been living abroad. The good thing that I can assure you right off the bat is that it does get easier. Some things I do videos about where I try to give tips and advice about a subject, and I can't honestly say that it gets easier, but I guarantee you language barriers do get easier, so there is hope if you're struggling with this right now. But it's still a challenge, and it still remains a challenge for me even after several years of having sort of immersed myself constantly in situations where language barriers would be a potential problem. One of the biggest ways that I experienced a serious language barrier and a serious lack of the ability to communicate was with my husband's family, actually. My husband is French, and like I said, I've only been learning French for a few years now, and so when we first started dating, I didn't speak a word of French. That meant that when I first met a lot of his family, we couldn't communicate, not even a single word. It was very different from everything that I'd experienced because the majority of times when there was a barrier, we could use English, or in the case of Spanish, I could use my broken Spanish if it was necessary. But really, I had absolutely no experience in French when I first started to get exposed to very French environments. So it was quite overwhelming. Speaking of my broken Spanish, during the couple of months that I was living in Spain, communication was definitely something that constantly got in the way. And this is something that I'm going to go into more detail probably throughout this video, but I think a lot of the reason a lot of us experience language barriers and are completely shocked and overwhelmed and we don't know what to do with them when we first start encountering them is because when you learn a language, in most people's cases, if you learn it at school, if you learn it with a class, you learn it in a very different way than how you end up having to use it in reality. If it's a good class and it's a good teacher, and if you have the right mindset going into it yourself, then you can obviously avoid some of these problems. But for me, having never lived in a Spanish-speaking environment before, I was completely unprepared, and I had really good textbook Spanish, but really bad actual fluent spoken Spanish. So a lot of the problems I ended up having communicating and just living and getting by in Spain were not necessarily because I didn't speak Spanish okay or I didn't have enough Spanish knowledge. It was really just I didn't know how to use it in the environment where I was. So I'm gonna let this go ahead and segue into the tips part of the video because it goes really well with tip number 1, which is simply, don't get bogged down in the details and don't get bogged down in what you can't understand. Especially if you've grown up pretty monolingual, but even if you've grown up bilingual, if you're adding on another language that you haven't tried to speak since you were a kid, you're not used to, as an adult, not being able to understand half of what you're hearing or more than half of what you're hearing. You're used to maybe the occasional word being sprinkled in that you don't know, but for the most part, you understand. There's nothing lacking in terms of huge gaps in the conversation or huge gaps in the sentence. When you're learning a new language though, it's very possible that the majority of the words that someone says are going to be unfamiliar or are not going to quite make sense, or you might have to sort of struggle to figure out what words they were even if you knew the words. When you're in a classroom and you experience this, you probably have a teacher who's going to walk you through it, or you have a textbook that's going to have a translation, or even if there's not a translation readily available, you can take the word, you can put it in your glossary, and you can go back and forth and you can figure out exactly what is in a sentence. But when someone's talking to you, when you're actually just in an everyday situation, you can't do that. The good thing to know is that you don't have to do that. You actually often can understand what's going on, can understand what someone's talking about or asking you about, and you can even respond accurately and well, even if you don't understand every word. But that's kind of a different skill than what you probably are used to using. The more and more you're exposed to language barriers, the more and more you're gonna get really good at finding those little words or those little phrases that you actually do know, being able to sort of piece it together and often actually understand what's going on. But you can't do that if your brain is doing that very natural but very bad thing of latching on to the very first word they said, which you didn't understand, and you've missed everything that came after, and you're just trying to think of what was that word? what is that? And yeah, you've already lost the train of thought and the train of conversation. It's really hard to do. It's so much easier said than done. And I still struggle with it day to day. It happens all the time, but it is something that you have to get better at, and you do get better at the more you practice and the more you remind yourself to do this. The second tip I have for you is kind of similar, but it's just to be realistic with yourself and also sometimes be realistic with the person you're talking to. I think a lot of times why we get bogged down in details and why we focus on what we can't understand versus what we can understand is simply because we expect ourselves to understand. Like I said before, as adults, we are used to being able to understand what's going on around us. As kids, you don't even think twice if most of what the adults above you are talking about, what's going on, or you don't understand it, you don't care. But as an adult, you get so used to being in an environment where you understand, where you know your place, where you know what to do, what to say, how to act. And so especially when you move abroad, but even if you're visiting, it can be very overwhelming and it can be very stressful because you expect those natural feelings to come back. You're put in situations where you think that you should be able to understand and you just can't. And you just need to be realistic with yourself before you're there, and while you're there, just constantly remind yourself, this is new, I'm probably gonna mess this up, that's okay. There's also a point when you need to be able to admit this to the person that you're speaking to as well. So you have to get really good at saying, can you repeat that? Don't be afraid to say, sorry, I didn't understand, or simply, I don't understand. I'm sorry, I don't speak insert language here, or I don't speak insert language here well. It seems so simple, but especially if you have taken a language course just at school and you've never actually been exposed in a native speaking environment, you're not necessarily prepared to do this, because in school you're expected to be able to respond to the things that you're given because you're only given stuff that you should logically have learned by that point. So it's all stuff that's been catered to you. And in a native speaking environment, that's simply not the case. There's gonna be plenty of stuff you don't understand, even if you speak the language pretty well. The third tip I have for you is to make mistakes. Yes, that is actually a piece of advice that I'm giving you. Say stuff that is wrong. Obviously, the ultimate goal is to speak the language well, to communicate efficiently, to not make mistakes. But that's impossible. There's just no other way to learn a language. You have to sometimes just plow through. You have to say things that inside you're thinking, that's not right, I know that's not right, but you don't know what is right. So you have to say the thing that you know is wrong, or divert and say something else even if it's not the way that you wanted to say it. You have to do that, and you have to experiment with it a little bit out loud in front of people and be making these mistakes in front of people before you can actually get comfortable and improve. Again, this is a process. It's definitely not something that you think about it and you go, that's the way, and then now everything's perfect, and now I'm not embarrassed anymore. I still get embarrassed almost every day. I do something that, or say something that is a bit embarrassing, and I think about it for hours afterward, because that's the way I react when I get embarrassed. It doesn't matter if it's languages or anything else, I dwell. But I've gotten so much better because I have really gotten over a lot of that fear and a lot of that embarrassment. In the case that you're dealing with a language barrier where you can't speak the language yet, and you know very few words and you know very few phrases and stuff, and you're just really at that very basic level, then I think this also helps, because there's a certain extent where it can be frightening just to say hello or goodbye or thank you in a different language if it's a very, very new language. Last year I visited Italy for the first time, and I don't speak Italian, and so every time I would try to say thank you, for example, in Italian, it's very similar to Spanish, and I would want to say Spanish, and I'm pretty sure I did say gracias to more than one Italian person. I'm sorry. But I tried, and that's the important thing, and I do think it made a difference, and even if it didn't make a difference to that particular person that I said it to, it made a difference to me, because I definitely felt like I was making that effort, and I was doing the very little bit that I could to break down that language barrier. It's very, very little in cases like that, I know, but it does make a difference. I will also add that most people find accents pretty cute, so just keep that in the back of your mind in case you're feeling a little bit unconfident about your skills. The fourth and final piece of advice that I have for you in this video is to learn the important things first. When you get stuck in a situation where there's a language barrier, where you need to be able to communicate and you can't always approach learning that language in the same way that you would in school, or the same way that you might if it was a long-term, years and years and years of investment type of situation. If you're experiencing a language barrier right now, it's because you need to know that language and you need to be able to communicate very quickly. So something that I've learned over time, and that I definitely applied as I was learning French as an adult and in a need-based sort sort of situation, is that sometimes you've got to just bypass that typical textbook route that everybody wants to take you down. You know, you start with your vocabulary lists of family and words around the home and words for different foods and things like that, and you start with your 10 basic verbs and how to conjugate them in past and present and future, starting with present, obviously, in most cases. But in the actual reality of using that language, that may not always be the best place to start. If you just moved abroad, for example, some of the most important things to know will be how to do your grocery shopping and how to find an apartment and getting Wi-Fi and getting a cell phone and things like that. So vocabulary centered around those things is going to be way more important than knowing what to call your cousin or your grandma in this other language. If you have to use this language for work, your vocabulary is going to be completely different. You may need to skip your fruits and vegetables and go completely for terminology related to your industry. In the reality of using a foreign language, it's not always going to go in the same order as a textbook. But when you're learning it, it can kind of feel like you're doing it wrong. It can kind of feel like you're skipping stuff and you're not doing what's important and you're not giving yourself that base that you need. But it's not a matter of picking and choosing what you're going to learn and what you're never going to learn. It's just a matter of reprioritizing and reordering the way that you learn the language. I think those 4 tips kind of sum up the main things that I've learned over time, and I'm still working on, like I said, about language barriers and about dealing with language barriers. Like I mentioned in the Q&A, I've gotten a lot better, and to be completely honest, I'm not that bothered anymore by language barriers. I guess I've sat in enough rooms where a whole conversation has happened in front of me that I've not followed at all. That's happened multiple times, and I've kind of gotten used to it. So whether it's me struggling to follow a conversation that I sort of can follow, or whether it's me sitting in a room with a language or several languages that I don't speak a word of, it just bothers me a lot less, but I was not always like that. It's something that I've built up, it's something that I've worked on, and like I've said multiple times now in this video, it's something I'm still working on myself. But it's nice to be able to sit back and to see that progress and to admit that progress and to say that and to be able to tell you actually for certain that it does get easier and it does get better. So now I would love to hear from you. Are you dealing with the language barrier? Have you had experiences like this? And do you have any tips to share that I've not covered yet in this video? As always, thank you for watching, and I will talk to you soon in another video.